Hello dear chess friend, I'm International Master Ostrovskiy, and this course is supposed to help you master minor piece endings. We start with the knights, and in this introductory lesson we are going to discuss main features of the knight to come up with the much better understanding of this piece, so that by the end you will know what to expect from this guy. Let's get started. The position that you can see on the board perfectly describes the first feature. At first glance, black is absolutely fine controlling white's passed pawn on g6 and having two connected passed pawns on the other side of the board. The king also looks very good, so the king is about to be activated to go to d4 or just to support these two passed pawns b5 and a4. But white has a winning combination. So white starts with the knight d7, attacking the king and the knight simultaneously, which forces black to take. And after knight takes d7, white plays e5. Great move that grabs f6 square, so exactly the square that the knight occupied just one move ago. And it was the key to stop the pawn g6, in fact, because after this e5, when the knight doesn't have the access to f6 square, appears that there is simply no way, no chance to stop g6 from a promotion. For example, if knight goes to f8 here, white just plays g7, and there is no chance for black to occupy the square that will control g8, and white promotes next move. If we capture the pawn on e5, then after g7 there is the same problem. So the pawn is about to go to g8, and the only way to stop this pawn is to put the knight on, let's say, e7 square, f6 square, or h6 square. But the knight has to go there just right now, which is not possible. So to occupy e7, f6, or h6, the knight needs at least two moves. And it appears just too slow in this particular case. For example, after knight g4, intending to occupy f6 or h6, white already promotes. So this describes the first problem, the first feature of the knight. So when it comes to the edge of the board, the knight has serious problems with mobility, serious problems with maneuvering. So it's a very natural thing, because we know that the best position for the knight is somewhere in the center where it controls a lot of squares, and closer to the edge of the board the knight starts controlling less and less, which inevitably causes the problems with the mobility. Let's have a look at the other example. Here we deal with the same problem. So white plays knight to g7, check, and after knight takes g7 and h6, surprisingly enough, black can't save the game. So the pawn is about to be promoted. White needs only two moves to do this, h7 and h8. And there is no chance for black to control h7 right now. And to control h8 square, so the square of the promotion, the knight has to be somewhere on g6 or f7. What is interesting, to get there, for example, to g6, the knight needs 1, 2, 3 moves. The same is about f7, for example, this way, e6, d8, f7. So 3 moves to get to f7 or g6, while white needs only 2 moves to promote the pawn. So black is definitely not in time to stop it. If king goes to f7, just supporting the knight and being able to recapture on g7 in case white takes, well, of course white doesn't take on g7 but plays h7 here, and there is no chance to stop the pawn again. So as we may notice, the pawn controls g8 square, so the king is not able to stop it, and the knight g7 actually deprives the own king of the possibility to occupy g7 square. So the next move will be h8 queen, and the game is over. So here we may notice that when it comes to fighting against the rook's pawn, the knight becomes especially ugly. And the next example describes this feature in more details. In this position, we can notice that white has a rook's passed pawn, and it is quite dangerous. After h6, we may notice that, for example, black's king is not able to stop it. So the only chance for black to survive it is to bring the knight to king side, and black is in time here to control the square of promotion. After knight d6, we can notice that the knight is about to occupy f7. It's not possible to prevent the knight from occupying f7 square here, because if king goes to e7, then knight goes to f5 with the fork, attacking the king and the pawn simultaneously, winning the pawn, and it is a draw, of course. So after knight d6 and h7 move, which looks very natural, black is in time to stop the pawn. So knight goes to f7 with check, but the problem is that after king e7 attacking the knight, it is necessary to occupy an extremely ugly position. So knight goes to h8 here, occupying just the position in the corner of the board. So black managed to stop the pawn, but it doesn't really help to save the game, because after king f6, the king not only attacks the g7 square, not only prevents the knight from moving to f7 or g6, but also limits the activity of the king. So the king can't be in time to blockade the king in the corner of the board, which means that after, for example, king e4, king g7, king e5, and king takes h8, white easily wins, because the king simply goes to either g8 or g7, and pawn h7 promotes. By the way, let's have a look at some sidelines in this example. So after h6 and h7, black is not forced to play knight f7 immediately, because there is no a direct threat of h8 queen. So black can try king g5 move. The point is that if white promotes the pawn here, then after knight f7 fork, it is a dead draw. So after king g5, white has to do something to prevent knight f7, because black is about to play king g6 attacking the pawn, and if the king remains on d8, well, it will force white to play h8, where after knight f7 fork works. So king goes to e7. Here it is no longer dangerous, because the pawn is already here on h7, and there is no fork on f5. In any case, knight to f5 is the best try for black, otherwise white simply promotes a pawn. And now after king f7, creating the threat of the promotion, and for example knight to h6 check, the king easily finds a safe square to avoid further checks, to avoid forks. So for example, king goes to e6, and there is no chance to stop the pawn h7. Once again, the knight occupies very ugly position on the edge of the board. Another interesting option for black is here. After knight f7 check, king goes to e7. Instead of playing knight to h8, knight can go to e5, again trying to exploit the motive of the fork. So if h8 queen, then knight g6 fork, and black manages to save the game. So in this position, white also is not forced to play h8 queen, and instead the king goes to f6. And now it decides, because the knight no longer has the access to g6 and f7 squares, and after, let's say, knight g4 check, the king simply goes to g7, and now it's not possible to stop the pawn h7. There is no fork, there is nothing, white simply wins. The same happens after knight to d7 check. Again, probably the best square is just king g7, avoiding further checks, and the next move will be h8 queen. So additional information that we can squeeze out of this example is that the knight is a good performer of different forks, and in fact it is the next feature that I wanted to discuss. So because of the ability of the knights to come up with different forks, or the ability to create the threads of these forks, well, the knight can achieve some interesting things, or with the help of the knight you can achieve some interesting things. So let's have a look at other examples. This position looks very familiar. White has the rook's passed pawn, which is already on a7, so only one step before promotion. The knight controls the square of the promotion, but occupies very ugly position at first glance, and black's king is far away, so can't really join the defense, which means that white should easily win. In fact, it is not that easy in this particular case, mainly because of the current position of the knight c7 and the position of the king on e5. So what is going on here? The knight controls d5 and e6 squares. What about other squares? For example, d6 square is not controlled, but appears that if king occupies d6 square, it leads to knight b5 check, and it is a fork already, so black manages to grab the pawn next move, it will be a draw. The same happens after king d4 move. In this case, knight goes to b5 once again, attacking the king and the pawn on a7. So what does this all mean? So in addition to e6 and d5 squares, which is controlled by the knight directly, the knight also controls d6 square and d4 square indirectly, which increases the control of the knight in this current situation and creates a barrier on the way of white's king. So if white's king wants to approach the knight somehow, he has to go around, which definitely leads to spending additional time and gives black a chance to come up with the king's march, joining the defense. For instance, king f6, king goes to g3, king goes to e7, king goes to f4, king goes to d7, already attacking the knight. There are no forks. And if the knight goes to d5, then after king c6, white actually wins the game. We already saw this scenario. But the knight can go to the corner of the board in this particular case because black's king is just in time to blockade the king there if the knight is being captured. For example, king c6, king e5, king b7, king d6, and if captures the knight, which is white's best try, king goes to c7 just in time to limit the activity of the king completely. It is a stalemate and a draw as a result. Let's have a look at the other example. At the very first glance, this position looks absolutely lost for white because both the king and the knight are so far away from the queen side, where black has the rook's passed pawn, which just runs towards the promotion square. But again, this feature of the knight to control some squares indirectly helps white to save the game. So knight should go to g6. We will understand why it is the only move very soon. So after a4, knight goes to f4, and the main point here is if black plays a3, then the knight occupies key position on d3, being able to play knight to c1 if the pawn goes to a2 with the fork against the king and the pawn, eliminating the pawn and making a draw. And surprisingly enough, here black doesn't have a winning maneuver. For example, if king goes to c2, then knight goes to b4. So from b4, the knight stops the pawn from moving to a2, and also has the possibility to come back to d3 if it is attacked after king b3 move. And appears that black's king simply can't control both d3 and a2 squares simultaneously, so there is no winning plan. For example, king c3, controlling d3, but the knight goes to a2. And if the king goes to b2, the knight just comes back to b4 after king b3, knight goes to d3. Again, a2 doesn't help black because of this knight c1 fork. So black can try to limit the activity of the knight after knight f4. King c3 is the most tested reply, controlling d3 square and at first glance leaving white without this saving maneuver. But here white still has a chance to survive it. So knight goes to d5 with check. If king comes back to b3, then knight also comes back to f4, just being able to get to d3 in time. And if after knight d5 king goes away somewhere else, it's not clear where to go, in fact, because black has to control b4 square somehow. If the knight occupies b4 once the pawn is on a3, we already saw it is just a draw. And c4 square is again controlled indirectly. If the king goes to c4, then knight goes to b6 check and takes the pawn next move. That was, by the way, the only way for white to survive it. Let's go back to the initial position and see what happens if knight goes to f7. In this case, after a4, knight to e5, also trying to occupy d3 square, the king goes to c3. And if compared to what happened in the main line, in this case, white doesn't have this d5 check, and the knight simply doesn't have the normal way to stop the pawn. So pawn starts moving and white is lost. Also, it was important to come up exactly with the knight d5 check in a similar position in the main line, because after king c3, if white checks from e2 square, well, again, the knight gets too close to the edge of the board, and after king d2, knight d4 and a3, so position in which the knight must be on b4 to come up with the drawish scenario. Here it is not on b4, and after knight b3, king c2, knight d4, and king b2, well, the knight, despite being in the center, in fact occupies very ugly position in the sense of fight against a3 pawn, so there is no chance to save it. So only knight g6 followed by knight f4 being able to get to this key b4 square through d5 or d3, which depends on what black does here. Everything is based on this ability of the knight to control some squares indirectly. So as we may notice, the knight doesn't have to control a2 square directly to stop it from going there. I mean this line after a3 and knight d3. This really helps when you play complicated knight endgame positions, because you actually need to phrase the problem. So your main problem is the a2 move, but it's not necessarily that you have to control a2 square directly. So you can imagine the possibility of the fork, and well, this gives you new target, and this new target is c1 square, or in some cases b4 square. Let's have a look at the other example. In this position, white fights for a draw, and the main problem is of course the pawn e4, which can't be stopped by the king. It's easy to understand that a simple chasing with the knight doesn't give white anything, so after knight d6, e3, let's say knight to c4 and e2, the knight is not able to control e1 square in time, so pawn promotes and black easily wins. So instead of playing knight to d6 move, white plays king to f7, creating a threat of the fork on f6. So check and takes the pawn on e4, which forces black to play e3. Knight goes to f6 with check, king goes to h8, and again it's not that clear what white is going to do, because still it's impossible to stop the pawn e3. But knight goes to d5, attacking the pawn, and after e2, knight goes to f4, again attacking the pawn, and at first glance it is very stupid because white simply forces black to promote the e2 pawn. In fact, this knight f4 move is a fork, and very important one, so the knight not only attacks the e2 pawn but also g6 pawn, and everything becomes clear after promotion, which is black's only try to win the game. So knight takes on g6 with check, and after king h7, knight goes to f8 check, king h8, knight g6, and it's not that hard to understand that white comes up with a perpetual check in this case. So as we can see, knight's great ability to come up with different forks can lead to absolutely surprising scenarios. So here knight f4 was the key idea, and of course everything started with the great king f7 move, which actually enabled this perpetual check. All the pieces like the king, the queen, the rook and the bishop can perform triangulations. The knight cannot, which sometimes leads to very ugly situations, just like the one you can see on the board. White has enormous material advantage here, so extra knight and extra pawn. The only problem is that the king is imprisoned on h8 square, and this prevents white from actually promoting the pawn h7. And the only chance to change the situation here is to do something with the king, f8, which has two squares, f7 and f8 at his disposal, to blockade the king on h8. So a great thing would be to control, for example, f7 and f8 squares with the knight at the moment, just like here. But the problem is that at the moment white's turn to move, and the knight has to go away from g5, so that to lose the control over f7 square, which gives black a chance to put the king on f7. For example, if knight goes to e6 with check, after king f7 we have the same problem. So it will be great just to wait a bit and to give black a chance to move in this position, because f8 square is controlled, and if the king moves here, then of course our king gets the possibility of going to either g8 or g7 with the further promotion. But white's turn to move again, and after, let's say, knight e8 check, king f8, and so forth, white simply can't make progress. So what is going on here? Let's come back to this position and try to understand why the knight cannot come up with the triangulation. First of all, what does it mean to come up with the triangulation? It means to make 3 moves from the initial position in which you want to lose a tempo and cause a Zugzwang, so that the last move, I mean the third move, will be exactly the move to the square where your piece was placed at the very beginning. So if white wants to win this position, he has to achieve the same one with the knight on g5 and the king on f8, but with black's turn to move. So let's have a look what is going on if white tries to come up with this triangulation. So knight goes to f3, king goes to f7, knight goes to d4, king goes to f8. So knight d4 was already the second move, so now it's time to come back to g5 in order to win the game, but it's not possible. So to get to g5, the knight has to make 2 moves, and after knight e6 check, king f7, and knight g5 and king f8, we have exactly the same position like at the very beginning of the maneuver, and it is the same turn to move. So still white has to move, and this means white achieved nothing. So we can see that the maneuver included this f3, d4, e6 and g5 squares, which is not a triangle. It is a quadrilateral at best, which sounds and looks cool, but doesn't help in the sense of causing a Zugzwang. So that is a very important feature you should remember. So the knight cannot win or lose tempi by simple moving, and you definitely should take this into account. How to win this type of positions? We're going to discuss this in the theoretical part very soon. Thanks a lot for your attention, and see you next lessons.